Well, good morning, my Social 30-1 students. Today, we are going to continue in our saga on democratic systems, challenges to democracy, and we're going to be looking at the other four challenges. Yesterday, we focused on the first challenge, which was first past the post. Today, we'll be going into the other challenges to democracy. My lovely number two. All right, so like I said, yesterday we looked at the first challenge, which was first past the post. And I think the biggest thing you need to understand about first past the post is that your elected representatives are not proportional to how you vote. And sometimes they do that to create stronger governments, more majority type governments, etc. It's very traditional. And it's very hard to change. You'd have to go through a constitutional amendment to get any of these changes to occur. In the United States, similarly, they have a first past the post system in electing presidents, congresspersons, senators, etc. All right, so today we're going to be looking at disenfranchised voters, but we'll also be looking at the other challenges to democracy in a little while, including party solidarity, appointed representatives, not elected, and then finally, outside influences on government. All right, the best argument against democracy, yeah, we've been complaining a lot about democracy, is have a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. Okay, sometimes people vote based on a whim, they don't have a lot of research, they don't really know the candidates, they kind of just vote the way in which their friends vote, etc. And so some people would argue that democracy is spoiled by allowing too many people to have a say that literally have no, you know, I guess in no better words, business in voting. Winston Churchill said that, by the way. Consider voter turnout in the 2008 Alberta election, provincial election, was only at 41%, okay, which is not that many. Okay, they probably thought at the time that the PCs were going to win quite handily. Okay, the 2008 federal election, however, was a little bit higher, well, actually quite a bit higher at 59.1%, but still was fairly low at the time. All right, so overall, challenge two is disenfranchised voters, voter apathy, voters saying, you know what, we don't want to take part in this democracy anymore because it doesn't speak to us, it doesn't represent us. Okay, so how do we, and one of the issues with that is that, if fewer and fewer people are deciding elections, then the people that ultimately decide the elections will, uh, make all the decisions. Well, here's a stat. Okay, the Canadian government voter turnout from 1972 to 2004. This would be an example of the downturn of voter apathy, and it'd be interesting to see, how it's progressed, since 2004. Now, I believe there was a bit of an upturn, in the first Justin Trudeau election in 2015. Okay, but overall, the trend seems to be going down from 1972. Here's another stat, and this is a much um, more broad stat. Okay, now part of the reason you can see turnout as percent of the population on the bottom, and then voter turnout. This one it's a little bit more stagnant, ranging from 75 all the way up to about 80% in the 1960s, and all the way down to just below 50% in 2008. But like I said, there was a bit of an uptick in 2011 and 2015. Okay, so, as far as history goes, there isn't a huge difference in voter turnout. Okay, but you look at this stat as percent of the population, it just seems like it's just not that many. Here's another stat you could look at: the percentage of people that vote based on age groups. Okay. If you're looking at this chart, it looks like as the older you become, the more you're willing to vote, the more you want to vote, the more that the issues perhaps are important to you. Maybe the less distracted you are by other stuff. Okay. Here's another stat: all age groups between 2011 2015, there was a huge uptick um, overall. But then, 18 to 24, 12% more people voted. 25 to 34, 11% more voted. Okay, 35 to 44, 10% more voted. Now, as you get older, there's a fewer percentage of people that voted because ultimately, as you age, seems like voting is more important to you. All right, so how do we make voting or the suffrage, the right to vote, more universal? Okay, how do we get rid of this issue of apathy, which is a challenge because, like I said, if fewer people are deciding our liberal democracy, then ultimately everyone else has less power and they don't have a say in what changes, etc. So, what could be some solutions? Well, one solution might be we're just going to force you to vote. Okay. Mandatory voting. Okay. They do it in other places where they literally fine you if you don't vote. Australia, for example, you receive a fine if you don't vote. And $50 for a lot of people is enough incentive to get their butts out of their off their couches and down to the local voting area and spend 15 minutes voting. Okay. They've actually enjoyed 90% voting turnout since passing this law in 1924. Now, the downside to mandatory voting, of course, is that, someone like myself, if I was forced to vote, I might just do some sort of protest vote. And that's never really good. And it's certainly not the mature thing to do. Citizens are ultimately required to vote in 30 plus countries, including Greece and Belgium. What could be some other solutions? Well, maybe we should just lower the voting age. Okay, remember the Tide Pod clips I showed you a little bit earlier? I don't know about that. Vote 16, for example, was started in December 2004 as an initiative involving members of each of Canada's four political parties with two principal aims. One, lowering the voting age to 16, encouraging young people to become more engaged in politics. Okay, what do you think by allowing people as young as 16 to be able to vote? How about this system? If you vote at age 16, your vote equals one quarter of an adult vote. At 17, your vote equals a half an adult vote. And then by the time you're 18, you have a full vote. I don't know about this one. It's kind of like, you know, training wheels or your learner's license kind of thing as far as voting goes. Ultimately, I think there's some 16-year-olds that know what the heck's going on a lot more than people in their 40s and 50s. But nonetheless, this is just one example of what could be done. Okay, what could be some other solutions? Okay, should we offer more choice in our politicians in Canada? Okay, because ultimately the Canadian ballot only offers us one choice. Okay, that ballot, when we elect an MP or in a provincial election we elect an MLA, we're only given a choice to elect one person because of our first past the post system. The American ballot offers actually a lot of choices, but with a lot of choices also comes with a lot of confusion. What do you think? All right, so this uh, lecture kind of went on with my old assignment. So like I said, if you have the old assignment or the one that we're working on in class, you can go ahead and work on that for a bit. But nonetheless, we're going to move on. Ultimately, to what extent do our systems reflect the will of the people? We have already discussed that first past the post in some ways does not reflect the will of the people. Proportional might be a better answer, but there are pros and cons with proportional. Okay. Once again, proportional allows for more fringe parties to become more prominent. There's a lot more instability. Governments would probably fall a lot more, etc. Here's a bunch of terms that you should be not so much prepared to know, but you should know from looking at this chapter. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I mean, aspects of democracy would be a free media, not one that is completely controlled by the multinational corporations or other countries. Okay, secret ballots. Okay, when you vote, people don't know how you vote. In Canada and the United States, we have some semblance of a separation of power between the branches of government. We're going to go into that a lot more detail here in a few moments. Okay, the United States has much more separation of power. We've already talked about what direct democracy is, okay, where people decide issues like in voting, referendums, plebiscites. An aspect of a separation of power is a judiciary that is independent from the executive and legislative branches. They are not swayed, they're not told what to do, they're not controlled. Another aspect of a democracy, especially a representative democracy, is we have periodic elections. In the United States, they have fixed election dates. In Canada, they're more fixed now. Okay, especially if you have a majority government, you know exactly when the next election is going to occur. But under minority governments, it's a little bit more nebulous. All right, universal rights. Everyone has the same rights. Canada is a multi party system. We have more than just two parties. That would be like a bi-party system. Canada practices something called responsible government. The executive branch is responsible to the legislative branch. If they ever lose the confidence of the legislative branch, they must resign. An election can be called, or other parties can be invited to form the government. Okay, we'll look at what interest or pressure groups, lobby groups are a little bit later. Okay, they work outside of government to convince representatives of government. They often work for multinational corporations. They might work for outside interests, etc. Universal suffrage is the right to vote. Canada practices a parliamentary democracy, parliamentary system, separation of powers, traditional British type House of Commons, Senate type makeup. You should know what a majority versus minority government is. More than half the seats is majority, fewer than half the seats is minority. Canada is a constitutional monarchy. Our head of state is the monarch. However, she is held under the power of a constitution, under the rule of law. We are not an absolute monarchy. Okay. And I think I put direct democracy in there twice. The three branches of government you see right there. We've already talked about proportional representation in contrast to first past the post. And, you know, I love putting things in twice. Maybe I'm trying to put more emphasis on separation of powers, but we'll get to that in a second. All right. You should be able to identify the similarities between the Canadian government system versus the American government system. I believe that's a question on your assignment. Okay, let's have a look at this slide here. And I apologize for these silly slides. Do not watch Team America World Police. I do not recommend it. Under no circumstances, absolutely never watch that show. Terrible, terrible, terrible movie. Ted Cruz ran for president, even though he was born in Canada. Once again, we're showing the Hulkster because he was all quintessential American. I am a real, okay, anyway. And then when we think of Canada, we think of Bob and Doug McKenzie. All right, now let's look at the Canadian versus the American system. And we'll just kind of break it up as far as branches of government. Both governments have three branches of government. The Canadian executive branch is modeled after the British traditional model, where the monarch is the head of state. The monarch is represented in our country by the Governor General. The Governor General is appointed by the Prime Minister. The person with the real power in our country is the Prime Minister, the leader of the largest party in Parliament. He or she chooses a cabinet, usually from the MPs, okay, that have won seats in the House of Commons. And so you're going to see some overlap here. And then the civil servants work for the executive. They work in the Prime Minister's office. They're deputy ministers of the cabinet. They're within ministries, and it just kind of filters down anywhere. So that is the executive. So of the people that are elected, the Prime Minister is elected, the cabinet is elected, okay, and the Prime Minister and cabinet are also part of the legislative branch, which is a big difference between them and the United States. Conversely, the president is the leader of the executive branch. There's no king, there's no governor general. The president is the head of state. He is indirectly elected by the people, but directly elected through the Electoral College to a 4-year term. Can serve 2 terms. I believe they can serve up to 10 years if they came in halfway through someone else's presidency. For example, if Donald Trump dies or gets removed, Mike Pence can become president right now, win the next election, and then win the next election after that. All right, so the president is elected. However, his cabinet is not elected. They're actually appointed and confirmed by the Senate. Okay, they are not a member of the Congress. They are separate. And that's one of the big difference between the United States and Canada, is that the United States has much more separation of powers. All right, so that's the executive branch. The legislative branch in Canada is made up, and they're both bicameral. They both have an elected, well, let me just go into it. In Canada, we have 338 members of parliament that belong to the House of Commons. They are elected, basically rep by pop. Larger provinces have more representatives than smaller provinces. Okay, and they're elected. The Prime Minister is also one of those members of the House of Commons. The cabinet that the Prime Minister chooses is also a member of the House of Commons. So, in essence, the Prime Minister and cabinet are powerful figures within the House of Commons, which makes them very powerful. Okay, and if you have more than half the seats in the House of Commons, you form the government, and your leader, becomes the Prime Minister. The other house in Canada is known as the Senate. Unlike the House of Commons, they are not elected, they are appointed. There's 105 of them. They are the distribution is done regionally. Okay, the Prime Minister appoints them. Usually, it's through a committee, but essentially, the Prime Minister still has a lot of power to appoint those senators. Okay, and they serve to a certain age. I think it's about 75. All right, so there's that. In the United States, though, all of their legislative branch is not only separate from the executive branch, but also completely elected. The House of Representatives, the Congress people that I've mentioned, the 435 of them, they're elected every 2 years. And they're the ones that control the House. Nancy Pelosi right now is the Speaker of the House because there's more Democrats than Republicans in the United States Congress right now as far as House of Representatives. The other branch, they're elected now for 6 years. There are actually more Republicans in the Senate right now than Democrats. Okay, they're elected for 6 years, which creates more stability. Okay, so every 2 years, 1/3 of the senators come up for reelection. All right, so there's that. Once again, in the United States, completely separate from the executive branch. The president and cabinet are not members of Congress. The third branch up here in Canada, we have the Supreme Court. Once again, appointed by the Governor General on the advice of the Prime Minister. Okay, 9 judges. They're distributed. I think there's 3 from Ontario, 3 from Quebec, 2 from the West, 1 from the Atlantic provinces. Okay, In the United States, you also have a Supreme Court. Those people are once again appointed by the president, but then, uh, you know, once they're appointed by the president, they're confirmed by Congress, specifically the Senate. The latest Supreme Court judge that was nominated by President Trump was Judge Kavanaugh. And if you were following the news last year, you saw the huge mess that went on trying to get him confirmed. Okay, but that's an example of that. The biggest thing you need to get out of the American government system is that the members of each of these branches are completely separate from one another. Whereas in Canada, there's a huge overlap between the executive and legislative branch, which ultimately would make the prime minister and his cabinet probably a little bit more powerful within his country than perhaps the United States with the president, because there's a lot more. We'll get to this term here in a second, checks and balances. All right, you probably have seen this picture. You're looking at some of the similarities, some of the differences. I think what I've done is circled a lot of the similarities between the American and Canadian democracies. They both have secret ballot. They both believe on first past the post majority rule. They both operate a federal multi-level system. We have federal governments, provincial governments, local governments. Instead of provincial, they have state governments. Periodic elections. Political parties believe in representative democracy. They both operate under a constitution. The United States Constitution was 1776 with the independence, later with the Constitution 1789, 1791, the Bill of Rights, and then the subsequent amendments. Canada, we have the BNA Act of 1867, not 1967, and then the Canada Act in 1982. All right. Here's some similarities. Here's some differences. I've been talking at length about this. Both bicameral, meaning we have two legislative branches. We just name them different things. Okay, we both have branches and levels. We both have a written constitution. We both have a federal system. However, differences in Canada, our senators are appointed, whereas the United States, they are elected. They're completely separate in the United States. Our head of state in Canada is the monarch, represented by the governor general, whereas in the United States, it is the president. And there's a lot of differences besides that. I'm just giving you a few. A couple videos you could look at, differences between Americans and Canadians. It's not so much about the government, but maybe just culturally. One of the biggest differences between the two governments is that the United States institutes something called checks and balances. And let's see if I can describe this as simply as possible. You can also watch the videos that accompany this slide presentation. The biggest thing you need to get out of this is, even though each branch of the American government is separate from one another, they can completely check each other's power. For example, so when the president nominates a judge, the Senate has to confirm it with a majority vote. Okay. If the president is doing something he or she shouldn't be doing, Congress can impeach him, which they did with President Trump. Um, Congress can impeach, and then the Senate will put him on trial and have him removed. Okay. The president, like I said, can nominate a judge. The uh, Congress can approve it. Okay. Um, the president can, Congress can pass a bill. The president, before it is signed into law, can veto that bill. Congress can override the so-called veto. Okay. And once again, I mean, I can read through a lot of these things. The courts can declare any presidential act constitutional. The courts can also declare laws passed by the legislative branch unconstitutional. Okay. The Senate confirms the president's nominations. Okay, and that could be cabinet, that could be Supreme Court judges. Congress can impeach judges and remove them from office. And so it's a check on each other's power. It keeps one branch from becoming dictatorial in nature. So make sure you know those terms: separation of powers, checks and balances. And these are lovely videos. You just pick one to watch and go with it. Canada has a bicameral legislature at the federal parliamentary level. We have two houses. We have the House of Commons, which is made up of 338 members, MPs, and then the senators, which are appointed at 105. The United States is also bicameral. They have a House of Representatives of 435 members, 2-year terms, and then senators, 2 per state, 6-year terms. A couple quick pictures of Parliament Hill. Uh, just for trivia, it's undergoing extensive renovations right now, so they're not even there for the next number of years. So here's the center block, here's the west block, here's the east block. This is the Prime Minister's office across the street. You have the Centennial Flame in front of Parliament Hill. You have the Supreme Court down the road. This is the Supreme Court. This is where the 9 Supreme Court judges rule on issues. I know, I'm trying to be funny here. They look like Santa Clauses to me. Very British in their tradition. I'm just going to go through this rather quickly. This is another picture of Parliament Hill, House of Commons on the one side, the Senate on the other side, the Peace Tower in the middle, offices, offices. There's a cat house. I guess Stephen Harper liked cats, or at least his wife liked cats, and so they had a cat house down the way. U.S. Capitol building, located, of course, in Washington, D.C. A couple other things to consider. What do you think about the layout of the House of Commons versus the American House of Representatives? Which one is most conducive to the facilitation of the democratic process? I don't know if I'm going to answer that question right now, but I mean, you'll see a stark difference between what goes on in Canada versus the US. So this is the Canadian House of Commons layout. Okay. The prime minister and the government will sit on the left side, whereas the opposition will sit on the right side. Okay. The person in the middle, where it says number 2, is the speaker, the so called referee of uh, question period, so to speak. You have parliamentary press, you have visitors gallery, you have the people that do all the recording, etc. So the essentially thing you need to understand is that the government sits on one side, the opposition parties sit on the other. Prime Minister sits right dead set in the middle on the front row. The leader of the opposition sits on the opposite side. Here's a real picture of the House of Commons. Let's contrast that with the U.S. House of Representatives. This was not this um, government, but the prior government, which the Republicans had a majority at the time. But they kind of sit in a semicircle kind of formation facing the front. Here's a picture of the U.S. House of Representatives. Every so often, the president is allowed to come into the House of Representatives and speak to Congress. That speech is called the State of the Union Address. He has to be invited in. Okay, normally he's not allowed into these areas. Here's the latest makeup the U.S. House of Representatives. Once again, 2-year terms, more Democrats than Republicans. And so if they want to impeach the president, they can do that because they usually vote en bloc. How a bill becomes a law, just not going there. Okay. But we learned about this in grade 9. Essentially, in Canada, it is read 3 times by the House of Commons. Between the second and third readings, it goes to a committee, an amendment, and then it passes. It goes to the Senate using the same process. Once it gets to the Senate, it can go and be signed by the governor general, and then it becomes a law. In the United States, once again, much more difficult. Okay. At any point, the president, well, not any point, but, before it becomes a law, the president has to sign it. And if the president doesn't like the law, he can veto the law. And the only way in which they can override his veto is if Congress, with a 2/3 vote to override the veto. It's very difficult to get any kind of 2/3 vote in the United States. Ultimately, who is more responsible to the people, the prime minister or the American president? Responsible meaning, if you want to get rid of that person, or, if, ultimately I'm responsible to you as students, I'm responsible to the school, the principal, the school board, etc. Which one is ultimately more responsible? Who can be checked easier? And I would think mostly the president can be checked easier than the prime minister. All right. So to sum up this lesson, I think we'll stop at this point, is that the prime minister, once he or she becomes the leader of the party and has more seats than anybody else in the House of Commons, they have extensive power, especially if they have a majority government. Ultimately, they are responsible to the legislative branch. But as you'll see in a further lesson, um, because of party solidarity, it's pretty hard to get rid of, especially someone that has a majority government. Whereas in the United States, if you wanted to remove President Trump, you could impeach him and then put him on trial by the Senate. And then with a 2/3 majority, you could actually remove him. There's been a number of, actually, just a couple of presidents that have been impeached. Andrew Johnson in the 1860s, maybe early 1870s, was impeached but was not removed. Okay, Richard Nixon was in the process of being impeached. Okay, but he resigned before that process could move itself out, and that was over the Watergate scandal of the early 1970s. President Bill Clinton in 1998 was impeached because he lied under oath about his involvement with one Monica Lewinsky in his Paula Jones deposition. I'm not going to say any more about that, but you could probably look at the process of impeachment going through that. Once again, he was impeached by a Republican dominated House of Representatives, but was not removed from office by a more Democrat controlled Senate. And then Donald Trump was impeached just this year because of the Ukraine scandal, but was once again not removed by the Senate. All right, we're going to stop at that point. This is 40 minutes in. We're going to cover the other three challenges to liberal democracy in the next slide presentation. See you later.